thanks for watching this message video. Today we're continuing on in a series called Standouts, where I'm talking about different people throughout the Bible who stood out because of their relationship with God or with Christ. Or in other words, the things that they said or the things that they did differentiated them from everybody else around them, and they were exemplary or good or worthy of emulating. And the two people that I'm talking about today are Esther and Mordecai, which were cousins. And the reason why they stood out is because they showed incredible obedience to God while living under the rule of an evil king. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of the Israelites, this was during the time when they were divided into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. But both of them, because of their disobedience to God, were in exile in Babylon. And during this time was when Xerxes was ruling. And he had thrown a massive party that had lasted 7 days. And on the seventh day, he asked his super hot wife, Queen Vashti, to come and parade her beauty in front of him and all of his drinking buddies, who also happened to be his advisors. But she refused to dishonor herself in this way, which set into motion a series of events that changed the lives of the Jews forever. And it provides at least 4 different lessons that we as followers can learn from. Here's what we're told happened first. Esther 1:15. What must be done to Queen Vashti? The king demanded. What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders properly sent through his eunuchs? Memucan answered the king and his nobles. Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to their contempt and anger. So his personal attendant suggested, let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem at the fortress of Susa. Hegai, the king's eunuch in charge of the harem, will see that they are all given beauty treatments. After that, the young woman who most pleases the king will be made queen instead of Vashti. This advice was very appealing to the king, so he put the plan into effect. At that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. He was from the tribe of Benjamin and was a descendant of Kish and Shimei. His family had been among those who, with King Jehoiakim of Judah, had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. This man had a very beautiful and lovely cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Hegai's care. Let's stop here for a second so that I can point out the first lesson that we can learn from this story, which is this. Only power-corrupted men treat women as inferior or as a tool to accomplish their own will. Make no mistake about it, from the very beginning of God's Bible, He's made it clear that women are not inferior to men or to be treated as such. In fact, according to God, man cannot possibly accomplish his will or plan or objectives on his own. So He made women to help men accomplish God's will, not to help men accomplish their own selfish will or desires. So we need to keep this in mind. That's our first warning. Beware of power, because even godly men can forget this, like King David, and inadvertently view women as a means to accomplish their own selfish will. Which leads us to the second lesson that we should learn from the story, which is this. Mordecai and Esther didn't resist when their human rights were being violated. I know that there are many who have rebelled or resisted against an evil king or a government mandate, perhaps, because they believe that their human rights have been violated. I know that I have. But let's be honest about this. Under what circumstances is resistance something that God would approve of? Meaning, what type of a situation would God bless our rebellion against an established king or a government that He Himself has put into place? For instance, look at what the Apostle Paul said. Romans 13:1 and 2. Everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. When is the right time to resist or rebel? Think about this. What if our president decided to round up a bunch of virgins throughout the entire country and systematically sleep with them to find out who was going to be the next first lady? Would you be cool with that? Would you resist or protest in any way? I'm not saying that I would be cool with it, but let's pay attention to this story and remember that lesson number 2 is that Mordecai and Esther did not resist. None of the Jews resisted. Never once did they petition for the courts to have a bypass on religious purposes or an exemption on this. In fact, we know that because they did not feel entitled in any way, shape, or form, they did not believe that they had human rights worth protecting. In fact, what we are told is that not just Esther, but that thousands of young women were brought into this harem, and that when it was Esther's turn to go before the king, well, he was not only so pleased with everything about her, he decided that the competition was over right there at that moment. She is queen. However, Mordecai had told her, don't tell anybody about your historical or ethnic background, which turned out to be a very critical element in this story. Here's why. Esther 2:19. Even after all the young women had been transferred to the second harem and Mordecai had become a palace official, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions just as she did when she lived in his home. One day, as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at King Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the 2 men were impaled on a sharpened pole. This was all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct since. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So on April 17th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Haman dictated. It was sent to the king's highest officers, the governors of the respective provinces, and the nobles of each province in their own scripts and languages. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. Again, power is something that can corrupt. And what we see in this situation that it was corrupting Haman. And he was developing a superiority complex, or he was starting to view himself as superior to others, particularly Mordecai and the Jews. But he had no idea that Esther herself was a Jew. And unfortunately, Esther had no idea about this decree that went out because she was secluded away from all of this drama in the harem. So Mordecai did this. Esther 4:8-17. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in and see the king. If I must die, I must die." So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. One of the things that I've said throughout this series is that it requires faith in order to be a standout for God, and both Mordecai and Esther clearly had faith. In fact, he said to her, "Even if you keep silent at a time like this, God will deliver. He will spare his people." That was faith on Mordecai's part. But yet notice that he was encouraging her to show respectful defiance or disobedience in this situation by putting her faith on display for God. And that ultimately, the reason why she was queen was for this very purpose, perhaps. Which leads me to the third lesson that we can learn from this story. Defiance should be shown only for specific reasons. Yes, it's true that there have been, on rare occasions, where God has asked his followers to resist or to rebel against an evil king or a government. But on every single one of those occasions, there was always a common denominator. Those people had a super close relationship with God where they were listening to him and they were constantly seeking out his will for their lives. Is that you? Do you have that? Mordecai had that. And that was the reason why he would not bow down to Haman, is because God was going to judge Haman, and we're going to see that here in just a little bit. And so in this same situation, here's now Mordecai suggesting to Esther that she respectfully show defiance or resistance in a situation, which gives us, again, a reason to be thinking about this third lesson, which is there are only specific reasons why God has ever given his people a right to rebel or to resist. Only specific reasons. And in this particular situation, the reason why they were resisting or rebelling was not because they were trying to protect their human rights. They were just trying to live. It was just survival. That's all it was about. They weren't trying to protect something that they felt like they were entitled to in terms of a human right. They were trying to protect their lives. So here's what happens next. Esther 5, 1 through 12. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Then the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." And Esther replied, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king." The king turned to his attendants and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet, as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet, and while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "Now tell me what you really want. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Esther replied, "This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about." Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet, but when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. Then Haman added, "And that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us, and she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow." Pride. It's one of those things that God really doesn't like. Actually, let me rephrase that. Pride is at the top of a list of things that God says that he hates or detests. If you've never seen that list, here it is. Proverbs 6, 16 through 19. "There are 6 things the Lord hates. There are 7 things he cannot stand. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that kill innocent people, a mind that thinks up evil plans, feet that are quick to do evil, a witness who lies, and someone who starts arguments among families." If you didn't know this, Haman was guilty of perhaps all of these things. In fact, the very next morning, he got up really early and had a 75-foot pole erected in his courtyard so that he could impale Mordecai on it, and then he went to King Xerxes to ask for permission to do so. However, As it turns out, that very night, King Xerxes couldn't sleep, and so he asked for the historical records of his reign to be read to him, and he discovered that Mordecai had never been properly thanked for what it is that he had done to save the king from assassination. So when Haman arrived early that next morning, Xerxes immediately asked him, "What should I do to honor somebody the king is pleased with?" And Haman naturally assumed that it was him, and so he said, "Oh, you should put that fella on the king's horse and parade him through town and have somebody ride in front of him shouting, 'This is what the king does to somebody who is pleased with.'" So Xerxes said, "Yeah, great. Go do all that for Mordecai." So the moment that he was done doing all of this for Mordecai was when they had to go to the banquet. Esther 7, 1 through 10. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you even if it is half the kingdom." Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I would remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." "Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Pretty cool, huh? Not only that, but right after this, we're told that King Xerxes literally gifted all of Haman's property over to Esther. Which leads me to the fourth lesson that we can learn from this story, which is this: God is always in control. Even though evil kings and governments exist, God is still in control. And if you remember what we learned earlier, God even puts them into those positions for his own good reasons. So yes, there will be some who will abuse power. They will use it for their perverted purposes or for their own financial gain, or they may be violent with the way that they protect their power. But that does not necessarily give us an automatic right or reason to resist. In fact, we learned from the story that there are times where God is up to something, and as a result, he is the one who is at work behind some of these evil things that we might see going on. Not that he is the one who was causing it, but keep in mind, if Esther and Mordecai would have been working against that decree from Xerxes, they would have been working against God, not with him. They did not resist. And the reason why they did not resist is because they had a close relationship with God. And so therefore they knew when the right time was to resist, as did many others. And there are times, whether that was with Moses or Moses' parents, or with some of the stories that we've gone through, like with Rahab, or with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Daniel in the lion's den. There are reasons why God wants us to resist or to rebel, but those were all born out of a close relationship with God. And when anybody has a close relationship with God, one of the things that they will always know what to do and when is when to submit or when to resist. And regardless of it, because of that close relationship, they will always know lesson number 4 from this story, which is God is always in control.